Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's webcast, Defend Against Insider Threats, Why They Are Harder to Find and Stop. Before I introduce our speakers, just want to run through what they're going to talk about today. First, they're going to discuss the insider threat background, give you a little examples of why they're increasing, explain a little bit more on why it's so crucial to stop these insider threats that are dangerous, and then give you some insight into some insider threat defense that you can have. Also, some real world examples they'll throw in there just to let you know how and why insider threats are so dangerous. All right. First speaker today is going to be Michael Ohanian. Michael is the Vice President of Product Management for SIM here at NetSurian. He leverages 10 plus years of product management experience, joined NetSurian in 2018, bringing with him an extensive background in cybersecurity-focused platforms and specializing in UX, UI design, and human-computer interaction. He also served as a nuclear propulsion submarine specialist in the U.S. Navy. And our second speaker, Saraswathi Ramana, is the lead client services engineer with over 15 years of experience in SIM, security automation, compliance, and managed security services delivery. All right, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Michael. Take it away, sir.
All right, thank you very much for that introduction, David. So I'm going to talk to you about insider threats and some of the main challenges that are facing security operations. These are some unique threats that are growing in number and growing in severity and growing in costliness over the last couple of years, and we actually expect that to increase along all three lines as well. But first, some of the challenges that are often facing security operations is that typically there's a marked focus on external threats. We see those big, noteworthy breaches in the news, the ones that are high profile and they're costly. And even if we look back at the history of cybersecurity over the last decade, it's typically been about protecting against external threats, leveraging things like firewalls, next generation antivirus, and so forth. And that's all great with perimeter defense and keeping the bad guys out. But that's where the focus is. So that naturally leaves the question about, well, what about the folks that are on the inside? And that's one of the challenges that comes up with insider threats is the lack of focus. Secondly, obviously in a very finite world of finite resources and with the focus on external threats, oftentimes it's difficult to prioritize those resources. And they're very scarce to do so. The expertise in this field is also very scarce. When we talk about prioritizing resources, when we deal with insider threats, a large bulk of those threats have to do with the people to our left and people to our right. And how do we know how to handle that? You know, it's easy to deal directly with the bad actor from beyond, but what if the bad actor sits 35 feet from you? You know, the expertise, the resources to handle that is oftentimes lacking. So because of that, these challenges make it difficult right off the bat to mitigate the risk from insider threats. So why we're covering this, first, it's great to share these insights with the cybersecurity community. At the end of the day, knowledge that we can share both inside our company and to our partners, to security practitioners and self, just bolsters that knowledge base, the defense mechanism against these specific types of threats. So part of the reason to cover this is to share what we've learned, to give some focus on how our event tracker managed threat protection offering safely guards customers and their users against these types of threats, and to just share some of this specific data that our cybersecurity experts that sit in our 24/7 SOC have experienced, have leveraged that data, have protected and mitigated those risks. So we wanted to speak with people today to share this information and help out and give another type of insight into this problematic issue. So quickly, Forrester Analytics predicts that there'll be about an 8% increase in insider threats. And by that time, we're looking at about a third of all incidents or all breaches will be caused or kicked off or started internally. And that number is up from about 1 in every 4. So as you can see, in general, this is a problem that isn't going to solve itself. It's not going away, and it's only getting worse. So for a couple of reasons. You could look at it as cybersecurity is always the game of cat and mouse. And as the defense posture and the infrastructure and the cybersecurity tools and software continues to get better, the adversaries are looking for new ways. So if it's not the tool itself, it's the person, for example, that becomes the threat. And then how do you mitigate against that? So it doesn't surprise me that in my experience with cybersecurity, that, like I said, as the tools become sharper, as things like EDR and advanced endpoint protection, so forth, become a lot more capable, that the threat starts to morph and starts to change, starts to take on a new form. And we'll get into that a little bit more in detail here coming up. So I want to talk about some of the types and some of the driving forces behind some of these insider threats and why they might be specific and like they might present a different or unique type of a threat in general. So the first are the inadvertent insider threats. This stems from carelessness, the improper handling of sensitive information. There's not necessarily with this first group a nefarious intent here, but still, nonetheless, it doesn't really matter that data is exposed or these costly potential breaches can exist or there's a vulnerability open up or a mismanagement of credentials. Inadvertent or not, this is still a very important group to look at for the type of insider threat. The next one takes that and puts kind of the intent behind it, the malicious insider threat. So an easy way to look at this when you talk about malicious is someone who might be, say, vengeful. Perhaps they've been working at an employer for a number of years and they got terminated, or they know they're getting terminated, they got a bad review. They hold a grudge, for example, and they think, well, you know what, I've got access to some of this very important data. I'm really going to harm my soon-to-be former employer by grabbing this data or displaying it on the dark web or going public with it or something like that. Like I said, the intent is there. In addition to that, what often falls in this group are people who seek financial gain. We'll look at that in just a minute here. But again, the difference between group one and group two, while both bad, the second one contains the intentful actions behind it. And the third one, the type of insider threat, is still bad, but a different flavor. And the reason why this is a different flavor is this one's tough to see because oftentimes it involves compromised credentials and logins or login information. So obviously we protect our networks and our infrastructure by secure passwords and logins, and oftentimes they're complicated and they involve special characters. But what happens when those are compromised and somehow a bad actor gets a hold of a common user's credentials or even a contractor's credentials, someone who has been given access with credentialed usernames and passwords? What if a bad actor gets a hold of those and now they can kind of just come in and out of the network without everyone even realizing it? Imagine someone coming into your workplace physically with a suit or a mask that looks just like one of your coworkers, and you don't even realize that the entire time it's not actually them. This presents a very unique type of threat, one that's very difficult to defend against, and that kind of rounds out the buckets of those three different types of insider threats. So it's very important to obviously detect these early on. And in our world, in the event tracker world, the security information event management world, one of the key concepts that we talk about is dwell time. With threats in general, dwell time is the time that an actual breach happens to the time that the actual breach is discovered. A good example to use what's been going on, if you've seen reports in the media recently, is that the SolarWinds breach was actually likely started around March or April, and that dwell time until it was discovered just happened recently. So for the past 6, 7, 8 months, this has been going on for quite a while. And dwell time is really, really important in our world because the longer something extends before we realize what's going on, the riskier it is, the costlier it is, the more damage that can be done. And this is no different than internal, external threats. For an internal threat, taking compromised credentials as an example, if someone gets a hold of those compromised credentials in, say, April, and you don't realize it until September, in that time, in those 5 or 6 months, they can go ahead and potentially install software that is dormant and looks normal and then kind of wakes up after 5 months. They can disable various cybersecurity mitigation software. They can be slowly extracting data on a day-to-day, but the point is, during that time, they can be walking in and out of your system and you might not even realize it. So that early detection is really critical to prevent the damage, to slow the cost down. So as you can see here, external threats still comprise about 75% of breaches. The internal threat is rising, and we expect it to rise. And the other part of it that makes this challenge is that third bullet point there. It's awkward to kind of audit or look at your own teammates. It's one thing to protect against the guy you don't know, the man or woman over the wall. But again, how do you potentially screen for those coworkers that you talk to on a day-to-day basis that you have no idea might have kind of a second life, where they're masquerading around to someone and they're trying to make an extra dollar here and there by extracting information or credit card information? How do you audit that and not damage your working relationship? You can't necessarily go to a coworker and say, hey, by the way, I think you might be a shady guy. Let's talk about your usage or your access to this private data, and kind of accuse or impugn someone without any real knowledge. But at the same time, it could be sometimes necessary. So the interesting thing about insider threats is they do present these unique challenges that can prevent us from having great security or mitigation practices in general. So it's something to always keep in mind. But in general, early detection response is key. Obviously, the faster, the quicker you detect something, the less damage there is. Data breaches in general, on average, cost about $9 million. And some of these are hard costs right up front. It could be fines because there's a PCI or HIPAA violation. The brand name or the goodwill of a company can be damaged or tarnished. Some companies even now have to offer, say, 3 years of credit monitoring, so there's soft costs associated with it. But in general, these threats are costly, and the quicker we could find out about them, the less costly we can make them. So really quick, we want to take a first poll. So how concerned is your team about insider threats?
All right, we're launching this poll now. Take a second and go in and fill out the poll. Find out if it's your top priority, one of your priorities, not a priority at all, or if you're just not concerned. Okay, closing that poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, the poll is closed. So I'm going to share out the results here, Mike. As you can see, 57% said it is one of their priorities, equal focus, and 43% said not a priority at all, more challenged by ransomware and phishing. Nobody voted for the top priority, and nobody voted not concerned.
All right, well, that's definitely a bit refreshing that no one said not concerned. However, for the 43% that it's not as high of a priority, not that I'm trying to scare people by any means, but we hope that when you leave here today that you might potentially see the value of perhaps prioritizing those a touch higher, looking at insider threats on a similar plane to other what we consider regular traditional threats. So hopefully this is educational for those folks as well. All right. So we want to look at some of the cause or some of the draws or some of the enticement of insider threats. Now, the first one relates a little bit more again to the lack of intent. Their errors or insufficient security policies and training or in place. With traditional external threats, it's a little bit more easy to grasp. If someone's trying to break into your system, they're either getting in or they're not. And the methods by which they do it are pretty standard. We can look at how bad actors attack systems, how they test vulnerabilities and so forth. But with insider threats, it's a little bit more amorphous. It's looking at the person behind the scenes. Like I said, they're already kind of in your walls. Can't sit there and look over their shoulder every single day. What are they feeling? Did they have a bad day at work? Are they going through a divorce or something like that? A little bit more, not as cut and dry. So because of that, it's a moving target. We necessarily don't have the sufficient security policies in place. We're not all psychoanalysts to sit here and look to our left and look to our right and realize that someone might be acting maliciously. So that's one of the reasons why these things can carry on. Secondly, some of these cyber criminals are looking for different ways to go ahead and get into a network. They're targeting sometimes employees, sometimes they're targeting suppliers. When you think of the concept of a bribe, they look at an employee, for example, that works at a high target institution that has a lot of personal information or social security numbers. They might reach out to that employee and kind of take hold of them and say, hey, look, if you get me access to this data, or you give me some of this data, I will make sure that you're significantly rewarded. And the cyber criminals are engaging in kind of a psychological warfare that's not just the blocking and tackling of conducting a cyber attack. So they're looking for different ways to get into the system, and this is one of those. And of course, the other one that we're looking at among many is that disgruntled insider. The graphic kind of goes along well here. The guy who's been terminated and has to pack up his things and get out. Well, he might have word that that's coming, or he might just be disgruntled. He feels like the employer owes him something and says, I'm perhaps in accounting as an example, and I usually have access to this data and credit card information, stuff like that. I'm already on the inside. I don't have to break into the network. This is 50% of the battle is already won. And so then they can get in there, and then perhaps they can, like I said, extract credit card numbers to sell on the dark web. So there's that financial gain. And when you're sitting right next to the pile of gold in Fort Knox, you might be enticed to become a bad actor, especially if you feel like you're owed something and you're a disgruntled employee. So these things together, again, are kind of three of the main ones to highlight among many reasons, but this kind of shows how sometimes there's a little bit of a different motivation or a little bit different type of way to get into the system, or a little bit of just a different look at why some of these different threats are caused or acted upon with a different mindset in general. So let's look quickly at why stopping some of these threats is crucial. First, they're definitely a little bit harder to find, and they can cause a lot more damage. The knowledge of these is more internalized. Obviously, with the unintended consequences or unintended threats, the careless employees, they can actually create a worse off situation. If an external threat comes and it's blocked by any of the number of defensive infrastructures or posturings that you have, it's kind of no big deal. Think of it as you've kind of got your coat of armor on and someone tries to penetrate that and they can't get in, end of day, we're done. But it's a little bit difficult to find when it's already inside your network. Again, there's the suspicious components are not necessarily looking at your coworkers and your teammates as potentially bad actors. So finding out what they're doing is not easy to do. On top of that, you couple that with the additional negative results, such as regulatory fines, PCI, DSS, HIPAA, and so forth. So now you've got potential bad actors that are sitting to your left and right that you don't necessarily get that visibility of, hey, we blocked an event from the outside. They do it kind of in the secret. You don't really get that notification. And then what they're prying around and looking at oftentimes is highly regulated data that if something happens and if they're successful, now you have to deal with that. And then, of course, the loss of customer trust. 45% of customers will stop engaging with a brand in general, typically following a breach. That's pretty strong, and it's all about the trust model. And at the end of the day, if an online retailer or medical office or anyone has been seen with running loose with your data, and there's a breach or an incident that gets some notoriety, they will often see users leave that retailer or that medical provider pretty quickly. So they are difficult to find. Like I said, you get a notification if something is blocked from the outside, or you kill an IP address that's blocked from the outside. But when it's on the inside, it doesn't necessarily spring up. It doesn't necessarily show an alarm or red flag or a whistle kind of thing. And naturally, all of this can have that adverse effect on the business revenue, shareholder value, and so forth. So while these types of threats are growing and might have been a little bit more ignored in the past, I think definitely as there's we're more working from home, we have different kinds of access now to the systems. I think it's on us, it behooves us to look at these a little more seriously. So polling question number 2, do you have enough resources and support to address insider threats? After everything we've kind of talked about thus far, do you feel that you have what it takes?
All right, so launching that poll now. Simple yes, no, or not sure answers on this one. I'll give everybody just about 10 more seconds, and we can get the poll completed in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, closing it out, and I will share the responses here. So Mike and Saraswathi, we had 38% of our attendees said yes, they do feel like they have enough resources. 25% said no, and 38% said not sure. So kind of a split between yes and not sure, and then maybe some no's thrown in there as well. Sarah, how does that poll jive with what you understand?
Now that's not surprising at all. It's not at all uncommon to see significant amount of them saying, we're not sure if we are doing enough to catch the insider threats. The impact of these insider threats is felt equally, whether they're an SMB or a Fortune 500 company. Just having robust IT infrastructure does not make anyone immune to them. It's a systemic problem and needs constant attention. So you got to be on your toes at all times. Unfortunately, the way things are, the sabotage, the espionage, data theft, it's just not something that we see in movies anymore. These threats have cost Fortune 500 companies like Capital One, Tesla, GE a fortune. And like Mike said, more often than not, it's an employee with malicious intent. Like in the case of Tesla, where he stole enormous gigabytes amount of sensitive data and sold it to third parties. But what's more dangerous, though, is the employees who are unaware that their account is compromised. In case of Tesla, for example, the employee ran scripts using 3 of his colleagues' names. These 3 colleagues, unbeknownst to them, became part of the crime. They were neither aware that something was being run under their name, nor could they do anything to stop it because there was no monitoring against any of them. To all of those audience who, of the 43% of the audience who said that they were more worried about the ransomware, it's perfectly valid concern. But what you need to know is most of the entry point for the ransomware is an insider. It's, again, may not be malicious intent, but might be a loophole that they have left without having them having the intent to create one. There are also times that employees brag about loopholes and vulnerabilities on security blogs. And that can lead to a big loophole for anybody else to come in and grab that opportunity. In case of Capital One, for that example, it was a third-party vendor or a contractor, an AWS engineer, who did not have perhaps the malicious intent to cause harm, but nevertheless left a significant configuration issue that caused millions and millions of loss to Capital One. She even went on and bragged about it outside, but that doesn't really help. Even if the FBI caught the employee or the vendor, the loss is the loss. It's significant damage. It is a very complicated process to identify and pinpoint these insider threats. As in case of GE, the intellectual property theft of 19,000 files was something that they found in 2014, but they couldn't pinpoint the user who did it or prove it against that employee, though there were some suspicions. The employee continued to steal this data for years, for almost 4 years, until he was caught in 2019. So continuous monitoring is the only way to stay on top of this. It's good to be aware. It's good to put your resources into monitoring ransomware and all of the other threats, but it's equally important to pay attention to insider threats. Mike, do you want to talk about what our SOC does in terms of the process followed to do this?
Yeah, no, that's a great lead-in to our capabilities, because you just highlighted some outstanding examples of not only the damage that is done by insider threats, but the big name damage that is done with some of these companies, and also, like you said, how you might not even know about it. That was great. So with all that and talking about the challenges that we face, managed threat protection, the managed threat protection we offer here at NetSurian through NetSurian's Event Tracker can definitely help protect customers and mitigate these risks. And we believe that it's done across a spectrum of predict, prevent, detect, and respond. So in the predictive measure, we offer vulnerability management, threat intelligence, and we also stop attacks pre-execution. So when you look at it from an insider threat standpoint, Oftentimes insiders, perhaps if they're somehow tied to a bad actor externally, they'll open up ports or access or exploit vulnerabilities, and vulnerability management can capture that. We have threat intelligence available to see if they're calling out to malicious IPs, and then of course if they install potentially bad or malicious software, we can stop that attack even pre-execution. If you look at the preventative component of predict, prevent, detect, and respond, we have endpoint threat mediation, and of course, working with our Security Operations Center, we help customers establish strong role-based access control. On top of that, security awareness training, as we've talked about, oftentimes there's a knowledge gap in this realm, is critically important. And with our managed threat protection, we cover these bases very, very thoroughly. On top of that, still there is no such thing as nirvana. There's no such thing as perfect prediction and perfect prevention. So of course we want to make sure the detect component is just as strong. So obviously with our managed SIEM, our core competency, we're continuously analyzing logs. We monitor user detection, and most importantly, user behavior analytics. So for example, if I was a user in a network, you saw that Mike was a user, and through machine learning, you kind of got to understand a baseline of my behavior. Perhaps on or around 9 o'clock every morning, I logged in and I accessed very specific things. With machine learning, we can see that. With user behavior analytics, we can see that. But then what happens if randomly I log in at a different or obscure time and I start accessing things I've never accessed before? This type of information is captured within our managed SIEM, and our analysts will look at it and start sounding those alarms of like, hey, perhaps this user Mike, who is normally totally squared away and causes no trouble whatsoever, is now acting as a bad actor. We got to look into this. And again, what that does is that starts to shrink that time, that detection time or that dwell time, to mitigate the potential adverse effects of an elongated insider attack. And then lastly, the response. With event trackers, managed threat protection, the network is under the eyes of our 24/7 security operations center and our cybersecurity experts. They're continuously looking at those changes, looking at those logs. They can see if, for example, user Mike created a new user and gave that user admin privileges and so forth. They can see things like failed anomalous login attempts and see like if someone's trying to break in from the outside, maybe they got a hold of a username, they're not quite getting the password correctly. We'll get those alerts and they will be able to analyze that and respond to the incident accordingly by alerting our customers and letting them know exactly what's going on. And of course, forensic investigation, once they realize that a breach has happened, if it does get that far, being able to look back at the logs and all the data and come to a solid conclusion of what happened. So putting us all together as we look into this potentially scary and potentially damaging world of insider threats, managed threat protection with NetSharian's event tracker, leveraging predict, prevent, detect, and respond is a very, very strong defensive posture that we offer to ensure that our customers and their customers are safe. So not just to a direct customer entity, but as we service our customers and their customers as well. We want to make sure that this is squared away. So with that, Sarah, I think you want to talk about some great catch of the days that we have.
Sure. The reason, in fact, we call it the catch of the day is because it's not uncommon for the SOC to find some type of a loophole like this on a daily basis. It's scary. You would think that you have so many tools, so much of monitoring in place, and still there's something that gets away. But that's also the reason that it's really important to keep an eye on and have this 24-hour monitoring. Like you said, Mike, it's the after hours activity that's a very good example of trying to catch something that's out of ordinary. You may not see it during the business hours, but trying to build that baseline, the profile, and identifying anomalies in that profile is really important. The example that I wanted to bring about was one that our SOC found out at one of the branches at a bank location. It was a user who did not do this out of malicious intent. It was discovered later. But unbeknownst to that user, what the user did was, with good intent, wanted to catch up on some work, went home, installed a remote and access software thinking they can get done with some of the tasks that they were pending on. And it's, yes, certainly no harm. What brings this about is a big loophole. Once you install software that gives remote access to your company's network, and if you've done this without the approval of your company IT group, then there's no monitoring on it. Today you're accessing it, tomorrow it could be somebody else. There's no monitoring on the ports, the users who are coming through it, and the type of infrastructure that remote software is touching and what's going on with that software. So it's really important to keep an eye on these. Tracking any type of software install, uninstall, and keeping an eye on after hours activity is really critical to this. One of the other common concerns that we see among many of our customers is the senior executives. We can totally understand that senior executives don't want to change passwords often. It's one of the million things that they've been tasked to do, and it's not easy to remember passwords once every 60 days or 90 days when they expire, and you have to create a new one, and especially one that's complex and a paraphrase and all of that. But giving in to these demands and trying to set their passwords to never expire is one of the biggest loopholes. We've seen quite often that senior executive accounts are the ones that are compromised. O365 accounts or Azure accounts, they're very, very easy targets for many of the perpetrators or even the ransomware attacks. So that's why I was talking about the ransomware. It's more often than not, these are the type of insider threats that lead to those ransomware attacks. You leave a loophole, you leave these type of elevated privileged accounts lying around in the network, it generates a huge vulnerability, a huge liability for the organization. Mike, do you want to talk about some of the questions?
Sure, I think David's collected some questions as we've gone through this.
I did. I do have a few questions that have come in. If you have any other ones, please don't hesitate to enter them while Sarah and Mike are answering this one, or these couple. First of all, does work from home increase the risk of insider threats?
Yeah, I could go ahead and take that. It absolutely does increase the risk. Employees, they might feel less engaged or connected if they're not in the office, kind of under the watchful eye of corporate IT, but they still have access to a lot of the things that they're connected to as if they were in the office. And therefore, work from home may mean using these work laptops for personal tasks, putting some personal devices to use and so forth. So whether it's intentional, like I said, thinking, well, hey, I'm not at the office, no one can see what I'm doing, or unintentional by using your potentially unsecured personal devices to use work, that line is definitely blurred, and work from home is a contributing factor to an increase in from the risk of insider threats. Very good question.
Excellent. Thank you so much. What suspicious actions does behavior analytics look for?
Behavior analytics should look for any type of activity that's out of ordinary. What I mean by out of ordinary is generate a baseline for each user, then track where these activities are coming from. The out of ordinary activities could be logging in from geolocations that they're normally you don't see those logins from. If you're located in Kansas, you see activities coming from Texas or outside of the country, and you know that you don't have employees anywhere there, or you know that your employees are not on vacation, they're not in that location. Those are the type of activities that you need to be looking for. Then again, failed attempts to access critical infrastructure, or even your critical file folder structures. If there's numerous failed attempts, you do want to keep an eye on systems that are in your DMZ as well. It's not uncommon to see a number of brute force attacks, especially for those systems that are in DMZ. But what's important to see is there anyone that succeeded after enormous amount of failed logins? So keeping these type of activities, creating baselines and monitoring that continuously is really important for behavior analytics.
All right, thank you. Does MITRE ATT&CK touch on real-world insights on inside threats?
That's I want to jump at that one. That's an interesting question. Perhaps there might be an attendee on here who might have been on one of the other webinars we've given about the MITRE ATT&CK framework and how we've integrated that to Event Tracker. So very interesting and great question. It definitely does. MITRE ATT&CK in general, or the framework in general, looks at a lot of things that can be indicative of insider threats. It looks at various scripts that are run. It looks at brute force. Like I said, if someone potentially has the username of an account that has access to a system and they're trying to brute force their way in. But on top of that, a lot of what MITRE detects in general makes it easier to see the kind of the inner workings of an insider attack. So if someone is a bad actor, their insider network, they start running some malicious programs or scripts and so forth, or just doing so in a very patternized way, the MITRE ATT&CK framework will actually be able to detect that. Since we have that integrated into our Event Tracker console and our SOC analysts are looking at that, this does give us a sharper, keener eye to notice those threats quicker and get to the bottom of them. But a great question. Had to just laugh a little bit because that's a direct call back to previous webinars, and I think that's great.
Certainly, I was on those webcasts as well, and they were fantastic. So, did have a question come in, very technical. So I'm going to read it here, and if we feel like it'd be better to take it offline, just let me know. What is the recommended process for tracing internal credential brute force attacks when the source is showing as blank or in the security and net logon logs?
Yeah, I can take this one.
Okay.
This is a very, very, very common scenario. We see this at so many of our partners and customers. It's one of the applications running on those networks, or it's a radius log or an attempt coming from outside where you don't see the local login IP address. That's why you have the source network address is blank, or it's unknown. But it's definitely an application that's opened up to an internet on those systems that's causing that. So the way to go around that would be to look at every application log. It may or may not write into Windows event logs, but you need to look at all of those. It could be radius logs, it could be IIS logs. These are the ones where you see the source network addresses blank. So you really want to look at any application that's exposed to the internet on those systems.
All right. Taking care of it. That's fantastic. Thanks so much for that, Sarah. Couple more here. Maybe I missed it. Are you considering supply chains and third-party partners to be part of insider threats?
Absolutely. They're certainly part of insider threats. I mean, they may not be employees who get the same benefit as your other employees in your organization. But once you've provided them access to your network, whether it's a third-party vendor, contractor, anyone that has access to any type of infrastructure in your network, in your enterprise, needs to be treated as an insider threat. The zero trust policy needs to extend to everyone who has access.
All right. And then we have one final one, unless something comes in while someone's answering this one. How does Event Tracker specifically help with insider threat detection?
Sure, I can go ahead and take this. Like we had previously mentioned, Event Tracker and our 24/7 SOC is continuously monitoring activity, not just on the network or on endpoints itself, but we monitor user activity. We leverage things like machine learning to understand what I would call normal user behavior. We look for deviations in that. Through detailed log analytics, we're looking to see if users, for example, create other users and give those users admin controls. We look for users who input USB drives and then copy the data from those USB drives onto various parts of the network. And while a lot of these activities are typically benign, we still look at them. We still look at the logs and look at the behavior associated with them, and then we will alert on that behavior. So in just a quick snippet, I could probably talk about this for 5-6 hours at a time, not just from a software standpoint, but like I said, from a experts or human eyes on the keyboard standpoint. Those experts behind the scene who are monitoring the networks 24/7 really get at the heart of what's actually going on by looking at the data and then starting to make those calls with those analytics. And I just wanted to point out too, in the question 2 questions ago that Sarah had answered that was so incredibly specific. I just thought that was great because from my perspective as a product manager, Sarah is a subject matter expert well beyond anything that I could ever understand. But what it really shows is the power of having that human expertise behind it, that no matter what, the software itself is great, but having the human expertise, like Sarah demonstrated, like having a SOC analyst look at it 24/7 is really where the power of this comes in to mitigate against these attacks. So like when we had that poll question up of, do you feel you have what it takes to prevent these attacks? Obviously, a lot of it's referring to the personnel or the expertise on staff. And I thought that question to Sarah about something that was so specific came up and like just had the answer at the ready and knew it from knowing it. So the expertise component, the human component is great. With Event Tracker, we offer that as a total holistic offering across the predict, prevent, detect, and response spectrum.
All right. Well, just looking through our questions, that appears to be all the questions we have for today. So wanted to once again, thank you, Mike. Thank you, Sarah, so much for all the insight you brought today. Thank you to everybody who attended. Hope you learned a little something. If you have any other questions, you can always reach out to Neturian. We're happy to answer them. Obviously, we have experts like Sarah on staff who can do that. So that is all I have for you today. Thank you so much once again, Mike and Sarah, and have a great rest of your day, everybody.